Okay. Hey there. It's Mr. Everton. I know, I was about to say something. Well, whatever. I'll probably re-record this video next year. I'm sorry I forgot to do this yesterday, particularly for some of my students who are like, Everton, be more responsible with getting your videos out on time. Don't tell us we have homework and then don't publish the video. Sorry. Today's video is about the transatlantic slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade. And we're going to be asking the question, how did the slave trade transform Africa and the Americas? It also transformed Europe too. Except the transformation for Europe was generally, one could argue, well, at least monetarily, it was a good thing for them, money-wise, economically. This political cartoon illustrates an idea that we talked about in an earlier video called mercantilism. The mother country is obviously sitting down at the table, being brought a variety of nice things by the colonies who are waiting on the mother country. And one colony is bringing gold and silver, and another is bringing food, and another is bringing raw materials. And the mother country's like, oh, me. So that's Europe in this situation. Europe is the one getting waited on. They're the ones being handed things. More accurately, you would say that they were taking things. Europe, before this time period, Europe had been relatively unimportant. They were off to the side of things. They were not the center of global trade. But during this time period, they began to explore and conquer parts of the Americas, and they established themselves as a really important center of global trade. A lot of times, this trade network, the Atlantic trade system, is sometimes referred to as triangular trade, because you end up with a triangle going from the Americas, North America and the Caribbean, over to Africa, and then up to Europe. And those 3 points on the triangle all contribute different things. So triangular trade is part of mercantilism. So remember, mercantilism is an economic system where European countries, mother countries, were exploiting colonies in order to get wealth. And so the European role here is to produce manufactured goods. Europe wants gold, so they're establishing these colonies, and then they're extracting natural resources, bringing them back to Europe, where they're turning them into manufactured goods, and then they are selling those manufactured goods back to their colonies to make money. That's all designed to create wealth for them. Now, the Americas, their point on the triangle is that they represent the natural resources. The Americas are where all the land was that could grow these cash crops that Europeans wanted so badly: sugar, cotton, coffee, tobacco, etc. So that's where all the land is. That's where the farming is happening. That's where the natural resources are being harvested. The Americas are where this system that we talked about in class called chattel slavery was invented. Slavery here, so, we talked about this in class, but slavery was not always like this. But the version of slavery that Americans know, because that's the version that was practiced here, and that's what you learn about in American history classes, historians call it chattel slavery. That word chattel sounds like cattle. They come from the same root word. This is owning people like property, the way you might own a farm animal like a cow, which is, obviously disgusting and morally repulsive. It's slavery based on race, which was a new thing that had not been the way things were done. This is deciding that people who have darker skin color are worth less and therefore should be the ones doing the hard work. Since slavery was based on race, this meant that the children of slaves would be born into slavery because they would have the same race, and so they would belong to the owner of their parents. This meant that they would be slaves for their entire lives. And this meant that they could be bought and sold as property, which means that families could be separated, which means that the owner of another person, the owner of an enslaved person, wouldn't really be thinking about their welfare the same way that, you wouldn't necessarily think about a cow's welfare. Like, you want to keep the cow healthy, but you're not like worried about giving it its favorite food to eat, or like fixing up the barn real nice so that the cow is happy. And so, like, yeah, like when you're not treating people like people, that means they're going to be dehumanized, and they're not going to have very good living standards. They're going to get fed less quality food. They're going to wear poor quality clothing, and they're not going to be treated in any way that a human being wants to be treated. I'm telling you stuff you already know, but it needs to be said. This led to a social hierarchy based on race in the Americas, with people from Europe at the top, and then free people of African descent below them, and then enslaved people of African descent at the bottom. So this is a racial hierarchy in the Americas designed to perpetuate slavery because it makes Europeans money. Slavery is a form of coerced labor. Coerced means forced. And so the role that Africans played in this Atlantic trade system is that they were the laborers. They were the source of the human capital, the people who did the actual work on the farms. Africans originally, when they got involved in trade with Europeans, they were a source of like gold and silver and ivory and like other natural resources, but they also had slaves, and more Europeans saw that Africans had slaves for sale, usually people who were captured in a war or who had committed a crime and were enslaved as a punishment. And that was something you could buy from Africa. And the Portuguese and the Spanish and later the English saw this, and they were like, oh, well, that's what we want. Like, that's the number one thing you have that we want. Get us more of that. This led to, like some historians have argued, this led African countries to start fighting wars they wouldn't normally have fought in order to try to get slaves. And this also led to kidnappings, because there weren't enough. I have kidnapping written on one of the slides somewhere. Because there weren't enough slaves being, taken as prisoners in wars. So like Africans started going out and kidnapping other Africans to sell them, bringing them to the coast where there's slave castles like this one in Ghana, I believe, where they would store huge numbers of these people in dungeons. And then ships would come and take them across the Atlantic Ocean in what is called the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage is, it doesn't sound that, Middle Passage, like, doesn't sound terrible. It was pretty terrible. You can see here a diagram from an abolitionist group trying to show how many people are being put on these slave ships, stacked like wood underneath the decks, oftentimes, not allowed to come up for air for long periods of time. People going to the bathroom below decks. The smell must have been completely horrible. Many enslaved people never made it across the Atlantic. They died along the way and were thrown overboard. Horrifying, awful stuff. This had the effect of depopulating Africa. By that, I mean removing large numbers of people from Africa. Notice on this slide that the number of enslaved people is like way more people are going to the Caribbean than any other place. And then after that is Brazil. So Americans tend to think of everything being about the United States of America, but like the United States of America is one country that was involved in this system. But all of these other places in the Americas were involved in this system oftentimes longer than the Americas were. This is not to let the United States of America off the hook in any way, just pointing out that we're not like exceptional here. Like, we're just one of many places that was doing this. Because the healthiest people in African society were the most desirable people to sell and to enslave, that meant that Africa lost a lot of its like strongest, healthiest people, which meant that Africa, like the population of all these African countries, started to become less healthy. There were less people to do jobs that needed to be done. And a lot of these governments in Africa that were engaging in the slave trade started to realize, like, no, this is not good because we're losing our population. But by that point, they had weakened and Europeans had strengthened, and it was too late. So the transatlantic slave trade became illegal at the end of the 1800s is when it finally was outlawed. But for a period of about 300, 400 years, untold numbers of, millions, thousands at least, millions of people. I should have a number in front of me. I don't. Millions of people were brought across the Atlantic Ocean by force, and were forced to do work for free in the Americas. And the money from that went to Europeans who used it to build up their countries and make them wealthier. So how did the Columbian, not the Columbian Exchange, sorry, that's a mistake. How did the slave trade transform Africa and the Americas? Thank you for watching this video. I know it's not like the easiest thing to watch. It is an important topic though, and I'm glad that we are learning about it. All right, bye.